a meeting on national level back then in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the legal department. I'm not a legal person, so I get the answer that was given to us from the legal department of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We cannot sign the convention without getting into details. So I mean, they are professionals and.
Is that political?
I guess it's political.
United States.
I guess it's political.
I think this should be really clear to all of us about the action that we are, in fact, really lepers in this issue of cultural diversity.
Diploma programs in Israel are not degree programs. I think maybe you meant certificate programs. I mean, there's a difference between a certificate and a diploma. A diploma in Hebrew is a teudah. That is an academic program. Whereas a certificate at the end of a program may not be an academic. It's two different things.
No, but you see, in Hebrew, many times we use the word diploma for certificate. לימודי דיפלומה, באוניברסיטה לימודי דיפלומה. דיפלומה של מחשבים וזה, which is not, yes. We use the word diploma as a synonym for a certificate in many cases, yes.
Any other questions of clarification? Well, as I say, we have time to open it for, I think, more of an exchange of opinions, brainstorming. There are representatives here from different types of institutions. I just want to throw out a few of my own questions which grabbed me as I listened to the people. One is maybe maybe the first question is a stupid one, and that is, are we in Israel sufficiently aware and involved in all of this? Because not just actually in the Bologna process, but how involved have we been over the years in Tempus and Erasmus Mundus? Have we been working too slowly? Are we just really waking up to that? And those of you who know about that maybe would like to comment. And I'd like to ask from different people representing different institutions here, I'd like to ask, say, the Malag or the Ministry of Education, what in a sense do you expect from the universities and the Michlalot? What would you like to see happening at that end for a big push forward? And I would say to myself and to other people from universities, what would we like to see, say, from the Ministry of Education or from the Malag, which really represents us to a certain extent? How do we think that maybe they can help us push this forward? And I'd also like to hear from our European guests, based on what they've heard in the last hour. I'm sure they've spoken to people over lunch and over coffee. How do you see potential Israeli greater involvement, the universities and so on? Do you have, in a sense, recommendations or pointers in terms of areas of interest where you would say, this is what you need to focus on? So in other words, I'm throwing out a challenge to every different group represented here so that no one has to remain silent, which is very rare in an Israeli Jewish audience anyway. But it's an open discussion, and whoever wants to take up any of those questions or any other questions, who's going to be the brave person to be the first to jump in? Yes, right at the back there.
I'm from the Technion, from the liaison office. I don't represent the academic world or the academic part of the academic world of the Technion. So why I'm here? I'm here because of a few reasons. First of all, I don't think that harmonization is the key word for universities. I think that excellence of the Israeli universities as individual universities and as a global group is an outcome of the individual point of view, individual relative benefit of each one of those. So I think we should think about harmonization in this particular world. Now, why Bologna and why Europe? At least from my point of view, I'm the one who is promoting the Israeli participation in the framework programs and other strategic R&D affairs, which are multinational, etc. For me, Bologna and all the academic consortia are complementary activity for the framework programs, actually, because we can build a multi-level of collaboration on strategic basis of each individual consortium for long run. It means that I can take one consortium, run from technological project to another technological project. On top of this, I can build a Marie Curie ITN or what we call training consortium. On top of it, I can build Tempus consortium. On top of it, I can build Erasmus Mundus Consortium, etc. So this can give a huge benefit, a huge added value to such strategic group, because we can then create new professions, create new disciplines, create new ideas for education. So just think about it. I think this is the main benefit of such activity from my point of view, and I don't represent the academic part of the Technion. Thank you.
Yeah, we won't answer each one directly. We'll just take a series of...
So this is a discussion that we have repeatedly, our colleagues and also with the Europeans, that I look at Bologna as two different parallel issues. One is the philosophical end to Bologna, which I happen to agree with Alex, that I don't think it'll play well in Israel, and I wonder out loud whether or not Europe is not shooting itself in the collective foot in the sense that Europe, at least recently, is not known for its innovation. There's been a problem, which is why we have the framework program and increasing investment in the framework program, whereas Israel has been excelling in that area. And to a large extent, I agree with Alex, that has to do with the fact that we give a lot of freedom to our lecturers and to our researchers to develop their own areas of research and training, and they're not limited to templates. You will teach this course in this manner for this many credits. On the other hand, I think that it would be hard to argue that the practical elements of Bologna, the ECTS, and the diploma supplement, for instance, are extremely valuable tools for facilitating student mobility on the one hand, and for increasing the dialogue between students and the registrars when they seek to go for graduate study, but also between the students and the future prospective employers, which is also one of the political reasons behind the whole mobility and Erasmus program, to increase eventual employability. So we have to look, I think, at Bologna in the practical sense and in the philosophical sense. On the practical sense, I think Israel has to go full steam ahead, which is what we're seeing. I believe I can speak on behalf of my partners in the Corinthian project. On the philosophical end, I think we're only at the very beginning of a discussion in Israel. And if I might just add one more point, on the one hand, I'm very happy that the Council for Higher Education decided this year, unilaterally I think, to introduce into the self-assessment a link to the learning outcome. I'll be very happy, or very inquisitive as to how the universities will react to that this year. Having never been introduced to that term before, to expect that in a year of self-evaluation, they're also going to and have any substantial knowledge to learning outcomes and be able to reflect upon it, I think it's a little bit too much to expect of us.
Marisa, maybe you can address this question.
Okay, first of all, the learning outcomes, it was the definition of learning outcomes from the Bologna Working Group was introduced this year, but the idea of learning outcomes has been in the self-evaluation guidelines for the past couple of years. The Quality Assessment Division is developing it more, reaction from Bologna, also from the United States, and the United States Quality Assessment is completely centered around the idea of learning outcomes. That's one thing. Second of all, the Quality Assessment Division every year has a couple workshops, both for the departments that are undergoing evaluation and also for the people in charge of quality assessment at the various higher education institutions. And they discuss this idea and this notion with the departments. Every year it's reviewed at these workshops. Lastly, I would say that it's not necessarily a unilateral decision. It's also come from the institutions themselves. People who are active in Bologna, Ben-Gurion University actually, the deputy rector spoke to us about this in length and asked for this to be put into the guidelines. It's seen as a way of exposing institutions to the idea of learning outcomes and bringing it into the culture of quality assessment and in general the language that is discussed in the institutions.
Okay.
With national and international educational and leadership programs. And I'm very excited about this day because I think many topics are brought up that are waiting to be brought up for many, many years now. And my question is, I spoke to this before with Joanna, I think that universities are supposed to serve the community in which they live, which is the Israeli community or local ones. and they derive from it. Everybody there comes from the local community. So I think it has to have some sort of community connection and not just an individual one. And with that, my question is, how does the Bologna agreement or focus can allow low socioeconomic background people to be more part of the academic surroundings? Because nowadays, it doesn't mirror what actually happens in this society. So this is something I find interesting.
Come.
My name is Melanie Sampson. I'm from the Israel Institute for Empowering Ingenuity, which is a new endeavor that we are undertaking. David spoke about challenges that he'd like to hear about what people are doing. So I'd like to inform everybody that we're founding an institute to promote innovation in engineering education in Israel on a national scale. And we're collaborating with an international organization called CDIO, which is considered to be a leading organization in the world in engineering education. And their aim is to design, what they do is they provide a framework model to design a strategic process to define the needs of what industry needs, to analyze those needs, and then to provide a model to implement the research outcomes and to assess all the courses and all the programs on an international scale. There are more than 80 programs, 80 universities in the world that are connected to this organization, more than 25 countries. And the whole issue, it's an excellent platform for Bologna because it's centered around learning outcomes. It has models for assessment, international models. It's totally aligned with all the European EURACE, with European qualifications framework programs, and with ABET, and with Bologna also there's been research that's been executed and to prove its alignment with all of the European qualification frameworks. And I would like to invite everybody who's here to join us in forming a national team of academics and industrial leaders, and together with the government to create a platform to implement the innovation that needs to occur in curricular reforms in Israel. Thanks.
This is a wide-ranging discussion. It's going a bit beyond the Bologna process, but that's fine. We rarely get a sort of a meeting of different people from different groups like this, so certainly doesn't do any harm. Yes, any further comments?
I actually have a question for the Bologna Center training center team. How are you planning to promote Bologna in Israel? What are the activities that you're going to promote?
I suppose I should answer that question. As you know, we are in contact with colleagues in many other institutions, and we're beginning with them and speaking with them and developing a relationship where we'll try to meet with them and hear what they feel they would want from the center, if anything, and there's no commitment. And we will try to see where we can meet, whether something that the center has to offer can meet some of these interests or needs. That'll be our beginning. We're also beginning internally, and this will come back to something that Eric just asked about the learning outcomes and how it's being applied. Marisa mentioned the meeting with the deputy rector. In our university, the deputy rector is responsible for the management of the evaluation process conducted by the Council for Higher Education. And the way the evaluation, this is for the benefit of our guests from Europe, the way the evaluation works here is that a committee is set up. It's a partly international committee and partly has members from outside the university, from outside the departments being evaluated. And prior to the evaluation itself, the department that undergoes evaluation spends usually about half a year preparing a self-evaluation report on all the parameters laid down by the council. Now, the way the scheduling is such that every academic department in Israel is evaluated or should be evaluated every 5 or 6 years. what our deputy rector who manages the process in our university decided is that every department, as they come up to be evaluated, before they begin the process of preparing their self-evaluation, will be given a couple of presentations on learning outcomes by the Bologna Center. And this means that over a period of approximately 5 to 6 years, every academic department in the university will be exposed systematically to this part of Bologna. And this is a method whereby we will reach all the faculty within our institution. Now, this is just one template, but it's a template which could be developed to fit with other institutions' needs. This whole approach is very, very flexible. We are, I would say, anything except doctrinaire in the way we are approaching this. And that's the short answer that I can give you at this point.
The idea of focusing on learning outcomes come basically from primary and secondary education. And in the last 2 decades, especially the OECD, has led a very decisive policy, especially through PEARLS and PISA, to standardize the curriculum, narrow the curriculum, and focus on outcomes that are measurable. And there is a lot of criticism in the educational field on this overemphasis on learning outcomes. I didn't hear too much here in the discussion today about the negative effects of focusing on learning outcomes in higher education. And I just wonder if there is anybody here on the panel who could address this issue. Thank you.
I just come from the Quality Assessment Division, so we had a lot of debates about this issue, and there's a major movement from the student union in Israel to focus on the issue of excellence in teaching. And that's one of the main issues that they want to promote, and one of the main issues that they want the international committees, the international quality assessment committees, to focus on. And when we looked how to integrate that or to discuss that more in our evaluation committees, and we turned to other people, other organizations throughout the world, they said that the idea of excellent in teaching is more passé now, and the idea of learning outcomes is the one that they're focusing on. So it's not how to become excellent teachers, but rather how to ensure that your students are learning what you set for them to learn, which is one way of thinking about excellent in teaching, but I think that it moves the focus away from how to train teachers or train lecturers to be better teachers and to instill their students with a level of learning and all of the various aspects that teaching has in it, and not just how do we ensure that our students are excelling on tests and getting good grades and then going on to be good employers. So I think that one negative aspect of this idea of learning outcomes is that it stops focusing on how to train teachers, and it shifts the entire focus onto the students themselves and ensuring that the students are achieving and excelling and just in general excelling in the standardized tests that the universities are creating for them. So maybe that's one negative aspect, but perhaps you have others.
Sound there.
Don't worry, you're safe.
Okay. Well, just to respond.
And we also have in this country, we have thieves and car accidents, all the regular things that every other country has. When you hear the police sirens.
Well, just on the issue of learning outcomes, I just wanted to confirm that it is indeed debated in Europe as well. It's critically debated. The issues you have raised are in that debate, and if you Google, you will find lots of critical contributions written down by people and also empirical investigations about it. So the debate is a bit ideologically driven and therefore not always helpful. But the fear is that education will lose its open-ended character, and also that through outcome orientation it will be too much oriented towards what employers need, and thereby lose its critical function. Yeah, but there's also aside from that, there's a difficulty of professors who are used to thinking in terms of what they want to convey in terms of knowledge, to moving towards the student actually learns and needs. So, so those who are proponents of learning outcomes, they see that as a paradigm shift from teacher-centered to student-centered learning, and see that as a challenge. But many professors take a more philosophical stance and say it's not that they have a problem with being student-centered, but they see the danger of this whole approach. It of course depends on how you implement learning outcomes. There are many ways of doing it, and of course there are ways of doing it that leave room for open ends. But yeah, then you are really into the technical implementation. So I think, yeah, you need to be critical, and maybe when you do seminars on it, invite people who look at it from different angles.
Yeah, I would agree with what Joanna said, but I would also say that if you look at the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance in European institutions, there are 3 sections in it. The first one applies to internal quality assurance, the next one to external quality assurance of the institution, and the third one of agencies. But in the first one of the standards is about the quality of teaching. So there is a sort of a balance in the discussion at the moment, because one of the issues we would have is what do you do with ineffective or poor teachers? In Ireland, we can't fire them. We have no means of doing that, because if they're in a public institution, they're public servants, and at the moment we would have no means even assessing what is a poor teacher. So there's huge debates, because sometimes the poor teacher can be a great facilitator of learning as the students all seriously panic and they go off to the books to learn for themselves. One of the Nobel Prize winners years ago in my own area was an appalling, Leninger was an appalling teacher. He spoke to the board, no question of microphone or handouts or any of these kind of things. So the students all seriously panicked and went off to the books. So in fact did extremely well. So he facilitated learning by the students, but in a way that today would not be acceptable in most of our organizations. So I do think Joanna's right, but there is a tension between the learning outcomes driven approach and that what the student has achieved, and it can be reduced down very much, and that's a danger, a real danger. And between the requirement then that the students perhaps would like, they just want excellent teachers who'll ensure they have acquired the learning and that they're just giving them the knowledge that they want to know. So there is a tension between the approaches, and I think the debates will go on for a long time. But in any seminars here, I would advocate getting people who are pro, who are against, and who have experience of all, because the debate is really what's most interesting about all of this. I suppose if I could just make another comment, just coming back to what Sarah was saying, in Ireland we also too have a binary system. We have universities, we have higher education institutes of technology, we have private providers, not universities. We have no private universities, they're not allowed in Ireland. And there is a tension and a discussion and a debate between how you transfer across the different areas. What are the progression rules? Our framework of qualifications has helped that enormously, but there is this, will we accept in the person with whether it's called a diploma or a degree from another institute, it might not be a university, etc. So these discussions, there are ways of sorting out all the accreditation issues, but one has to have the discussions and the debate, and it isn't easily solved.
Yeah,
Marek wants to say something.
A story about Polish learning outcomes, which is very funny, because last year our ministry decided to Bolognize all Polish higher education. Therefore, there was a series of decrees, I think probably the most bureaucratic decrees in Europe, in all Bologna world. When they so first, ministry determined so-called subject area learning outcomes. There were some teams of 8 subject areas like humanities, social sciences, medicine, agriculture, and so on. So divided all possible fields into 8 subject areas. They established a list of learning outcomes for this area, very general. Plus, the ministry added some competences like everybody shall be entrepreneurial, everybody shall be good, and so on. It was a personal decision of our minister, probably Kudrycka. And then all of a sudden they told that all universities have to formulate all study programs in Poland, that means, I don't know, tens of thousands of programs, in the language of learning outcomes, and we have only 2 months to do this. And we did it, in a way. So on the one hand, one could think, it is just a kind of bureaucratic exercise. However, as we are rather rational people, so the problem was how to formulate learning outcomes for each study program in each Polish university in a reasonable way, and to fit these subject area learning outcomes. And I personally supervised this exercise in University College Tarnów, where we have 15 different subject areas, like, say, nursing, mathematics, Polish studies, physiotherapy, and so on. So we have totally different subject areas. And what I saw, that people really, when they were formulating their study programs in language of learning outcomes, more or less, say, 50 learning outcomes per curriculum, more or less. So it was like this, 15 concerning knowledge, 15 concerning skills, and maybe 5, 10 corresponding to the social competences. So they really were rethinking what they are doing, how they will evaluate it. So in a way, it was very stimulating exercise. And now in Poland, we have to give also seminars and some training sessions to faculties, how to do this. And I think that if we approach it in a rational manner, so it could be very helpful really for deep restructuring of our higher education and the way of thinking about higher education. Just to finish, short example. Usually academic folk is very angry when they have to formulate some outcomes for, let us say, personal and social competences. How do we do it? It's not a science. But I explain to them, okay, you often complain that your students do not give back their papers in time. You can introduce then learning outcome, time management. Or something like this. Or you complain that students do not write their assignments in proper Polish language. Then nobody prevents you from putting learning outcomes, even for mathematics or for, say, engineering, like this, appropriate use of native language. Yeah? And in such a way, I tell them that learning outcomes can be an important tool to achieve what we want to achieve. And if we present it in such a way that it is for you, in order to send better signals to different stakeholders, like students, employers, and your colleagues from other universities, what I really want to teach, what I really want to achieve. Then the people are less aggressive and they accept this idea of learning outcomes.
Okay, we're going to allow some final words to each of the panel. Although we've slightly rambled around the topic in the last half an hour, at the same time, I think it's important for also us to realize, sometimes we use these concepts of harmonization and standardization, and we think, but we ourselves aren't sufficiently harmonized or standardized between ourselves. I would actually venture to say that the Israeli higher education system, despite the fact that it's very easy for us always to focus on where we're different from each other, we're actually a very highly standardized system in terms of how we teach, how many points a degree has, what we pay lecturers. We're actually a very highly standardized system. Yes, there are differences at the edges, and I'm sure that what we've heard from a number of examples here in Europe, we would suggest that certainly there may be less internal standardization, whether it be in Germany or Ireland or Poland, and yet nevertheless there's still a framework which allows the Bologna process to move forward. It's just sort of a reflection of mine on what I've heard. So if each of the three panelists would like to...
a question.
You want to ask?
Yeah, okay. A question to the European, because in our here meeting, sometimes we deliberate the whole issue of bottom-up and top-down. And I think you mentioned something that I didn't understand exactly, but it seems to me that exactly like you had now the decree about you have to formalize the learning outcomes, it seems to me that if the Council for Higher Education would take a more proactive top-down stand about the diploma supplement and the ECTS, it would be easier to implement it than waiting that each institute and each higher education kind of colleges will do it. What do you think from your own experience? This is the debate that we are having. Yes.
That's a throwback question. I'm not sure exactly what our time framework is, whether it's till 3 or 3:30.
3:30.
And we have another open forum afterwards. Okay, so let's, for the moment, go back to our three panelists. We'll keep that question open, and we'll see how time enables us. But if you want to relate to any of the points which were raised, no. So if you want to answer Sarah's question, and
have this discussion, me and Sarah.
It's actually, it's a bit uneasy feeling for a researcher to have to formulate very clear-cut policy recommendations. What I would say, yes, go for some national guidelines, but based on very thorough consultation beforehand. Yeah, and then maybe it's difficult, but find the issues where national standardization is fruitful. There are some, but shouldn't be too much and shouldn't be too narrow. But you know, if you allow freedom in the wrong places, then you get a jungle in the end that doesn't serve the aims. So yeah, it's a tricky issue, especially on ECTS. If you want, there are arguments to be concrete, yeah, for saying you want just ECTS packages, like in Ireland at your institutions it's 5 or 10 or 15 or 20.
That's just mine.
Yeah, you know. Yeah, so there's a temptation to do that. But then on the other hand, it makes people squeeze their programs into these packages, whereas they don't fit. So they have to inflate the workload or deflate the workload. So then it doesn't make sense. So these are very tricky issues. They need thorough consultation before you enforce any standardization. But I would say yes, but after thorough consultation.
You had another comment now, yeah.
I think the good wisdom of Jan was being very good, and her presentation sort of kept us on keel. I always like to say that we don't have a word for teaching. Our word in Hebrew is to cause to learn, the lamed, and the teaching belongs to God, which is the Torah. So I think that the approach must be of learning outcomes, and teaching is that not to have one or the other. We need the excellence which you mentioned. We waste so much time in the department committee on questioning students who are falling behind. Well, that student's okay, rather than saying, okay, let's spend more time on the student, which is okay. So I just want to put that part into its context. I've been privileged to be in the Corinthian process, and I think that this is a key part of since the National Tempus Office of 2010. In other words, what Eric said is that there are two parts of it, the philosophical part and the technical part. We need to, in my mind, we're at a crossroads. How we now start putting the Bologna process in Israel is very critical. And I'm very wary about focusing on the technical aspects. In other words, we now have to have time out with the National Tempus Office, and on the basis of the Corinthian results, to think what is the best way to market it. And I think that although that the philosophical part has been put to the side, that is the main issue. That is the main issue. That's what we have to be able to say. And the Bologna process, which I've learned, is the platform for this debate. And it's quite clearly put in the Ben-Gurion's one of the processes here. And I think this is going to be, if we start going on, putting on diploma things and working on the technical things without giving some great thought about how we're going to put it in Israel, we'll start off on the left foot and the whole thing will fall to pieces. Now, what has taken place in Europe, what I've heard, is that people have used this structure for managing money. So therefore, doctorate 3 years, therefore the money given by the government will be for 3 years. I do not know of somebody who does a doctorate in 3 years in Israel. And it's, I mean, it might be done, but that is the exception, not the rule. In other words, to move it away from this aspect of the technology, keep it, yes, we have to deal with it, this is something which is important, but what we need to do is to think about this by this debate. It's a crossroads decision now. I think it's very, very critical. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Expert. I would like
the person who, whenever we have a question about Bologna process, we ask.
I'd like to come back to Sari's question about the bottom-up and top-down. For one thing, I don't think we should be looking for clear answers for doctrinaire answers, because I don't think it'll be either bottom-up or top-down. It'll have to be some kind of, it'll have to come from both directions in Israel, I believe. But what I wanted to say is that when we were setting up the international office at Ben-Gurion, we gave a lot of attention. There's a very rich body of American literature, not on Bologna, but on setting up international offices, on internationalizations. And it was largely studied there on the institutional level. It's not on a national level. There's no, well, the US is a very interesting example of a country where almost the entire function of the Ministry of Education nationally, federally, is to provide scholarships, funds for scholarships. They have almost no other significant role in higher education in the United States. But there are a lot of studies on internationalization on the institutional level, and the conclusions were almost inevitably that there had to be leadership from the top university levels. When internationalization was being initiated from the bottom up, local initiatives, which is what we've seen in Israel historically, the result was what Marek likes to study, chaos. A totally chaotic system that's uncoordinated and no university policy. So there has to be leadership now, whether it has to come from the Council for Higher Education, whether it has to come from the Conference of Rectors, what we call VERA, our Council of University Presidents. But within the institutions, there has to be some direction at the institutional level. Otherwise, you end up with chaos, as we've seen in the case of internationalization and in the case of some other unfortunate initiatives that have tried to progress in Israel.